Today marks the start of high-level debate at the United Nations General Assembly in New York. Diplomats are trying to find a way forward on threats to global order, such as the conflicts in Ukraine and Gaza. But leaders also raise another threat today, the threat to the legitimacy of the very organization they spoke to.
The Security Council, like the UN itself, needs to go back to the job of making peace, of brokering deals to end wars and suffering.
Our United Nations is facing a crisis that strikes at its very legitimacy. The UN is under attack, literally.
So, is the UN too broken to help solve crises around the world, and can it be fixed? Richard Gowan is the UN Director for the International Crisis Group, and he joins me now. Richard Gowan, it's good to meet you. Thanks for being here today.
Thanks for the invitation.
So let's start with the mood at the Assembly this week. I mean, there's a lot of big issues on the table, but what are you hearing about the UN being an essential organization capable of tackling these issues?
Well, there's a bit of a contradiction because on the one hand, you have Joe Biden, Prime Minister Trudeau, and lots of other leaders here, and everyone is dashing around and holding press conferences. So it can feel quite exciting. It can even feel a little bit like being at the center of the world. But I think there is also a deep underlying sense of concern about the way that the UN is headed, because the last year has probably been the hardest in the organization's post-Cold War history. That is primarily because of arguments over Gaza, but also because of arguments over Ukraine and Sudan. And I think a lot of leaders are being quite frank and saying, what are you doing? Where is the Security Council and where is the UN when it comes to fixing these wars, which are only expanding as far as we can see?
It was remarkable. We showed the image of President Zelensky earlier speaking to the Security Council, of which Russia is a permanent member with a veto, and Russia has invaded his country and is getting support from China. And you know, it speaks to the challenges and the contradictions as you laid them out. So, I mean, we've seen these vetoes at the Security Council just to stop any movement on conflicts like Gaza and Ukraine. So what's stopping them? I mean, the Russia one is obvious, but I mean, when it comes to Gaza, what's stopping them from finding a way around this veto paralysis?
Well, in the case of Ukraine, it's Russia that has repeatedly used its veto. In the case of Gaza, it's the US, which used its veto on a number of occasions in late 2023 and early 2024 to stop the Security Council calling for a cessation of hostilities in Gaza. And unfortunately, a lot of non-Western members of the UN in particular feel that the US and its allies have demonstrated double standards, that they have been standing up for the Ukrainians, but not standing up for the Palestinians. This, I think, has been quite damaging for the Biden administration, which had done a lot of good work, in fairness, to rebuild goodwill after the very turbulent Trump era in the UN.
Yeah, I know that the global South is frustrated with the orientation and structure of the United Nations, that so much of it is tilted towards a World War II European North Atlantic sort of power dynamic. But we did see President Biden there today as a supporter of multilateralism and institutions, Canada as well, as you mentioned, with Prime Minister Trudeau. Big election coming up. 44 days away in the United States. It's a very different scenario for a struggling organization if Donald Trump is the U.S. president coming to speak at the General Assembly next year, is it not?
Oh, yes. I mean, there is certainly irritation with the Biden administration, as I say. But I think that most leaders would recognize in private that if you have Donald Trump back in the White House, then the UN could go into real shock. There's concern that Trump would both pull out of parts of the UN system like the Paris Climate Change Agreement, but also probably slash funding to the organization. There are a lot of Republicans in Congress who now have a deep, deep dislike for the UN because UN officials have been very critical of Israel over Gaza, and they would like to see the organization basically put under financial sanctions. So with a Harris administration, things will stay turbulent. With a Trump administration, it could become quite chaotic in New York.
But meanwhile, the General Assembly is looking at reform, right? It did manage to vote through this non-binding Pact for the Future, which is an interesting name. They did this on Sunday in hopes of sort of correcting course and maybe reforming things. I mean, can that work? I mean, without the Security Council being completely revamped in the way it functions and is structured, can there be the sort of meaningful change at the United Nations that people want?
I think what's very striking is that no one is out there defending the status quo. And actually, the Biden administration has repeatedly said that it is necessary to reform the Security Council. China and Russia acknowledged that, at least rhetorically, too. At last year's General Assembly, about 80 or 90 presidents and prime ministers referred to the need to update the Security Council. I think the number referring to it will actually go up this year. The problem is everyone can agree that we need Security Council reform, but it's much harder to agree on what that would actually look like. Countries like India say, justifiably, that they should have permanent seats and vetoes alongside the UK and France. But a lot of other countries, including China, are very, very keen to ensure that India doesn't get that privilege.
Right.
What the Pact for the Future, this big UN reform agreement that you refer to, said at the weekend is that we should accelerate talks about Security Council reform. And there is actually a lot of support for that idea under the circumstances. But it is possible that we will have lots of talks, have lots of debates, and find there is no one formula for modernizing the Security Council that can get the necessary support that it needs from the UN.
It's interesting. Everyone talks about their discontent with the status quo, but then nobody wants to change if it means surrendering the privileges they already have. But I just wonder about a question about legitimacy. You mentioned India. I attended the Commonwealth in Rwanda a couple of years ago, traveled there as part of the media delegation covering Prime Minister Trudeau's trip, and Narendra Modi skipped it to go to the BRICS meeting with Brazil, Russia, India, and China because of the whole shift in that dynamic. I mean, does the UN risk losing what legitimacy it has with countries like India and in particular global South nations and small Pacific nations if it doesn't undergo these kinds of reforms?
Well, I think we already see quite a lot of big powers prioritizing clubs like the G7 or the BRICS over the United Nations. And, you know, the G7 in particular has had a real shot in the arm because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Right.
I think it is worth remembering, though, that works if you're Canada because you're in the G7, or it works if you're India because you're in the BRICS. But there are a lot of countries, smaller, poorer countries, that are never going to be invited to these privileged clubs. And the UN is the one place that they've got where they can come and speak as equals, at least in theory, with the big powers. Something that we're seeing a lot of at the moment is poorer countries coming to the UN and making a very, very strong case for why they need more economic assistance and more help with international debt from the rich world. And this is really the only place that they can do that. So for some states, the UN, is still pretty essential. Mm-hmm.
Yes, and with the world polarizing between autocracy and democracy, there needs to be some sort of a fora for those conversations to happen. Richard Gowan, it was really good to meet you. That's Richard Gowan, the UN Director for the International Crisis Group. Thank you for being here today, sir. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.